Okay. Hello, welcome to our first installment of Women in Wealth, Turning Insights into Action. My name is Aimee Palmer. I'm the Vice President of Sales, Credit Union Wealth Management at NEI Investments, and the co-chair of Women in Capital Markets, WCM Prairie Steering Committee. In honor of this year's International Women's Day, NEI Investments, in partnership with WCM, is proud to host our esteemed panel as we discuss the advancement of equity, diversity, and inclusion in finance. We look at what can be done to address systemic barriers and how can we best support women by understanding their unique challenges today and into the future. A special thank you to our guest speakers, Lara Zink, CEO of WCM, Tanuja Patel, Vice President, National Accounts with NEI Investments, and to Tim Prescott, Senior Vice President and Head of Asset Management at Avisa Wealth and NEI Investments. Well, I'd like to start out by having everyone give us a brief description of their career journey and perhaps a fun fact. Tanuja, why don't you kick it off?
Sure, great. Thanks, Aimee. Really honored to be participating in this panel today for this special day. So a fun fact, maybe I'll say that I actually am a very avid downhill skier, which maybe most people wouldn't expect from me. So if I think about my career, why don't I start with, I started in 1995 in the asset management business, and I had a very traditional career path for that time. So I started in client services, I've moved to inside sales, and then I was promoted up to wholesaling. And that journey took about 7 years. So I was about 30 years old at that time. I'd been married for quite a few years. And of course, I was ready to start a family. And so back in the late 90s, there weren't a lot of women wholesalers, and there weren't a lot of women wholesalers that were mothers. And so I made the bold decision to that I wanted to start a family, and so I left the industry. And a lot of that was because I didn't feel at that time I could go up against the establishment, against the boys' club, and ask for a whole year maternity leave and still come back to my job. So I made the decision to leave for about 7 years. But it was a really interesting time because while I raised my kids and while they were younger, before they started school, I also ran my own business. And so that really set the stage for the rest of my career. And then it just worked out that when my youngest started school, the financial crisis of 2008, we were just kind of coming out of that, and we happened to sell our business. So it was a good time for me to think about getting back into financial services, which is what I did. So effectively, it was 13 years ago, literally to the date that I got back in. So I'll close my comments by saying that what was really surprising and encouraging for me when I came back to the industry were that all the advisors that I worked with prior also remembered me. And so that was really just so nice and so welcoming, and something I didn't really expect. And so what I sort of walked away from realizing was that having a place in a space where there weren't a lot of women that looked like me actually turned into a real positive, and I was able to leverage that to my advantage in my career.
Thanks, Tanuja, and that's amazing transparency that you had to come up and really think about how am I going to balance a family as well as work, and made the decision to step away for a bit. So thank you. Lara, what about yourself?
Thank you, Aimee. And I'd just like to say a big thanks to Avisa for your support of WCM and the work we do, especially our research and advocacy work that supports all of our sponsors in the areas of furthering ED&I in their organizations. So I worked in finance for almost 25 years. After completing my graduate degree, I joined the Royal Bank in my early 20s, I guess. And I joined a corporate lending program, a training program, and I was assigned to a business banking center outside of Toronto and Brampton. I was in that role for about a year and took that training and moved to another division within Royal Bank, which was more centered on institutional lending to our banking, partners that had repo lines and so forth, also our broker-dealer clients. And after staying in that role for a couple of years, Aimee, I moved to the wholesale side of RBC's businesses into institutional equity sales and trading. And I worked on the trading floor as an equity sales as an equity sales professional for 20 years. And over the course of, those 20 years, I took two parental leaves. Both of them were brief, I would say, measured in today's world, perhaps, where women and some men consider taking longer leaves of absence. But, I had a very rewarding career, and I was, privileged to have the opportunity to, afford full-time health that really helped me balance career and family. I always missed mornings. And, I was typically on the trading floor between 6:30 and, 6:45, but I typically was home for dinner. And many times, I was able to make it for soccer or hockey or, I think one of the most challenging times of my career was when my son was 15, he's now 20, but when my son was 15, just before getting his driver's license, and his ice time, with his hockey team was like 10:30, and we're going through Tim Hortons at midnight on our way home because he's, he needs a snack. And I'm, thinking that I got to be on the trading floor at 6:30 in the morning, right? So it was interesting, as, they always say, right? Little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. And of course that's not a problem, but I'm just giving an example of when there were different stages in my career where there was different friction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a fun fact for me is when I left RBC in 2019, I decided to throw myself into venture. And I'm now an angel investor in 5 female-led ventures in Canada. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm really excited about venture and, women's opportunity in venture in Canada. And, I've now been working at WCM for 2 years, super excited about our future. And I'm really happy to be here today, Aimee, contributing to this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Excellent. And, when you talk about those 6:30 mornings, I'm just thinking about how do you balance that? But I think, there's times in our life where it's ebb and flow. You're going to work harder, and then you have to find the time to, dedicate that to kids and family and social circles. So thank you. And over to you, Tim. And, I'm going to pause and just say, again, thank you for being here. For most people joining, they're probably wondering, like, oh, I typically would be expecting a panel of just women. But in my career so far in finance, I found the best way for us to engage with men and our male allies is to have them part of the conversation. So again, Tim, thank you so much. But over to you. Tell us a little bit about your career journey and a fun fact.
Thanks. And maybe I'll start off by saying thanks right back. I do appreciate the opportunity that we've opened the discussion up to talk about not only women's issues with women only, but allyship and sponsorship actually are 2 words that for me, if I add the third one in, which is mentorship, I think those 3 words actually are the opportunity that lies ahead for more men to engage in this discussion and maybe just understand where are the barriers and where are the biases that are inherent, particularly in this industry. And it's funny because I listened to Lara and Tanuja talk, and the similarity and the commonality of experiences actually may not know a gender in some places, because I've been through a Tim Hortons drive-through at midnight with my hockey players. I've watched as my spouse and my wife of almost 30 years now has made career choices that we've had to sit down and talk about together. And even in reflection, I can look back and say, where are the sacrifices that she made in her career to benefit mine? And when I tell my story of my career, mine's maybe a little non-traditional. I grew up in Northern Ontario, and I think the decision to go and get into financial services first involved me going in to see my local TD Bank branch and telling them I want to be in financial services, and if you want me to be a teller, that's what I'll do. And fast forward through a career at one of the big banks and finding a love for investment management and asset management in the financial markets in general. I found a passion in that and was able to progress my career through a number of sales roles and leadership roles, which have eventually culminated in me coming here. But to get there, I think of all the individuals that had to help along the way. And again, that discussion with my spouse and how we were going to do this is maybe back in the 90s, the traditional approach, and this is one of those barriers that we would speak to. The traditional approach for advancement in financial services was dictated by how mobile you were and how willing you were to uproot your family and move it around. And so we have certainly had stops in a number of thriving small town metropolises throughout Ontario, as we got to see what small town Ontario looked like before eventually getting the opportunities to progress careers and land in maybe some really safe spaces for longer periods of time. But we had to make difficult decisions and together as a team on when we would move and how often we would move and what the impact on our kids were when we did that. And so I think, I'd like to think that we faced them together, but obviously on reflection, you look back and think of all the sacrifices that are required to get a team up to this space. And for a fun fact, I don't know if it's a fun fact or maybe a guilty pleasure, love trashy spy novels. That's my kryptonite.
Okay, I hear you. Mine's more on the TV side, like Law and Order SVU. I've got like literally every episode taped. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. Laura, I'd like to kick it off just by asking a little bit, just in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We hear a lot about this. We know companies around the world are really starting to take stock in this. They've got really great, robust strategies. So perhaps, can you explain to our listeners, like, what is ED&I? And, lean into a little bit of why does WCM tend to lead with the E?
Thanks for the question, Aimee. It's a really important one, but, and I'll certainly give some background as to why we lead with E. That said, we are so excited about the momentum around ED&I, and we don't care as an organization what you put first, because it's just fantastic to have the engagement and the leadership, the tone from the top, coming from many of our sponsor organizations, all of our sponsor organizations, because of course, leading with support for WCM is a big part of that. But of course, many other organizations within the financial sector and beyond who are not direct sponsors of WCM. WCM leads with E because we believe that equity literacy is critical for driving awareness and education around how to create diverse and inclusive workplaces. So we put emphasis on equity, but it really, Aimee, stands for equity literacy. And I believe that WCM's growth and the growth and engagement that we've seen, especially over the last 3 to 5 years, it came out of the Me Too movement through to George Floyd's murder, and then into a black swan event known as COVID, which really shone a light on so many issues around ED&I that are critical for individual and employee well-being. The other trend that I think happened as a result of the pandemic, of course, was the reality that, we lost a lot of that progress in terms of women's participation in the workplace, because many women had to step out of their jobs during the pandemic to accommodate for extraordinary circumstances. So that's why WCM leads with E, and it's all centered around the importance of equity literacy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you noted a few things there. So we've recognized there are some systemic barriers. So, things like work-life balance. And now that we've got the opportunity to be able to work from home a little bit more, and we can tend to, again, that balance. So perhaps, what is Women in Capital Markets, WCM? What are you doing? What things are you implementing to help break down some of these barriers? And then I'll invite Tim and Tanuja to weigh in as well.
We're doing a lot, Aimee, but I'm just going to focus on one initiative as it relates to the parental leave pledge. And, this pledge is really focused on helping our sponsor organizations change the culture and the conversation around parental leave for fathers and non-birth parents. We believe sharing care really helps to not only enrich fathers and non-birth parents, experience at home, but it also really helps to lower the systemic barriers that women face when they decide to take parental leave. And really, the last time I checked, I'm fairly certain that reproduction was just that happened. It's been happening since the beginning of time. The reality for women, of course, as we all know, it's a longer recovery, and in many cases, the care responsibilities in North American society do predominantly fall on the backs of women. So the parental leave pledge is really encouraging our sponsors to change the culture of acceptance around fathers and non-birth parents taking leave to, again, help share the care. And Aimee, we acknowledge that most of our sponsor organizations have very generous leave policies for fathers and non-birth parents. It's the barriers and the culture of acceptance around men taking that, which is the real issue. So we're really excited about the 20 signatories that we have so far for our parental leave pledge, and really being a catalyst and a part of helping to change the conversation in the Canadian finance sector around that systemic barrier that's very real for women, but we've also found also for men.
Great. Tim, did you want to add anything just in terms of
Tanuja, I'll maybe go after you, because I think I'm wondering what the environment would have been like after you telling your story too. How that might have impacted your thoughts on your career progression.
Yeah, I'll just comment just briefly on Lara, this whole parental leave that you're working on. I saw it at the organization where I was at, that when some of my male counterparts were looking to take time off when their spouses were having their kids, I know a few of them said, I'd like to take longer than 2 weeks off. I would love to take a month, but they felt they couldn't because of, again, they had their own stigma that they were trying to work against. And so this is all good, because at the end of the day, right, there's two parents involved, right? And so both need to be part of their kids' lives. I know for me, so to your point, Tim, after I had my kids and I got back into the business, there was a whole analysis that I was putting together, and you're right, a discussion with my husband around, okay, how do we make this work? Where can I work in the financial services industry that is close to my house? So one, I eliminate the commute. And then number two, I actually did a search of companies that were ranked as most female friendly or family friendly. And then from there, I sort of filtered it, okay, who is in the financial services industry? And that's sort of what the exercise I went through before I got into it. But it was all good, and it was a good path. But I will say that when I got back in, despite the fact that I left the business at a senior level, and I ran my own business with a team of 20, 25 people, I had to start at the beginning again. So I was back at an entry-level position, and then worked for 2 years doing that to reestablish all my network before I could make the springboard to the role I'm in now at a bigger company. And so it would be nice for women to be able to take that time off, but get back in without having to do that. And then, Tim, before I hand it over to you, I'll just say one quick comment about sort of my take, and not necessarily a barrier, Aimee, to your question per se, but I feel like there's still this lack of education and awareness for the younger cohort. So if we're trying to build that pipeline for young women, it's still not there. And I think about, again, from my perspective, that I have a daughter who goes to a girls' school. She's 17, and she'll say there's so much focus on the science and technology and engineering and math, because that industry is really trying to beef up the number of women. All the education that comes from the universities is all around that. There's no business schools coming to the school to talk about an education in business or financial services or accounting. And so I think if we can start doing that and universities can get behind that, I think that will be a big help.
100% agree.
Sorry, I was going to just jump in on that because it's almost like this is a great example of a systemic bias, like and one that actually has very real consequences as well. So when you I think, Laura, when you mentioned it's a cultural change, the concept of cultural change actually creates more equity and equality at both at the same time on this specific issue. I have my wife and we have 3 kids as well, a daughter and 2 boys. But you look at the advantages that men have in as women leave the workforce for leave, the ability to continue progression, continue learning and development, and continue growth while still in a role is a systemic barrier when applicants then are considered for either re-entry or new entry back into it. And so, one of the ways to do that is to balance out time away in there to create a more equal and something that's more a little bit more equity in the discussion. And then, but for that to actually take place, those cultural shifts are very real. And I don't know if it's, I would say it's not specific, obviously, to the financial services industry at all, but it does show up here because it is so male dominated in the number of people that are there. So because the equity isn't there to begin with, the cultural bias is entrenched as well. And so the ability for men to take time off or even give thought to taking time off, I've seen in my career, which started in the 90s, and as I've watched my kids, we've made such progress, which is great, but it's only the start of progress. Like, we've gotten to a point where we can actually have a conversation, but have we really eliminated the cultural biases that are the systemic biases that are there associated with non-birth parents or fathers taking time off? But I think as we continue to force the discussion to happen, we will get to a spot where we can probably never eliminate, but it's a worthy goal, but we can really get rid of the entrenched values that are there simply by having some of the discussions. But Lara, I think your point is great. And I know having organizations sign on to the pledge with Women in Capital Markets, which we've been a vocal supporter of and hopefully seen as a collaborator in developing that policy. We think that it has to turn to action. And so, companies now have to take this pledge and start asking themselves, how are they going to create that environment where, people in a parental leave situation have the ability to even talk about it and then action it with no repercussions on the progress in their career.
100%, Tim, and we are extremely excited that Aviso signed on and is committed to being a part of that, conversation and that cultural shift. I have to tell you, if I really open my heart and put my true emotions out on this issue in terms of how important I believe it is for both men and also women, I would ask all of our sponsor firms to take the initiative of making 2 weeks mandatory leave for new fathers and non-birth parents. And I believe there's an investment bank, and I'm pretty certain it's Morgan Stanley in the US that does have this. And, of course, if depending on your circumstances at work at the time, right, this is a conversation you have with your senior manager, you determine what the right time is. But when the younger generation, that's coming up behind us in terms of the future leaders of our organizations, see senior fathers and non-birth parents, taking leave, albeit maybe just starting with this, 2-week and, mandatory leave as a start, it will go a long way to furthering the cultural shift. And, I think Tim and Tanuja and Aimee, you probably agree with me. During the pandemic, there was a lot of men in particular who saw, a lot more of the care, responsibilities that happen at home, right? So I do think this is a great opportunity to seize a trend that we're coming out of, again, this extraordinary time in all of our lifetime. And, of course, WCM is not going to, we couldn't make that one of our commitments, but certainly I think that would be an amazing first step. And to say to men and fathers and non-birth parents that, it's not gonna hurt your variable comp, that this is a part of, a culture shift that we're making in our organization, and we'd encourage all of our fathers and non-birth parents to take advantage of this benefit, as it also really helps to further equity and reduce systemic barriers for women.
Well, thank you all three. You all had such fantastic points. We know there needs to be a culture shift. It's these types of initiatives being put in place that are going to help facilitate that. Tanuja, you made a really interesting point too. We're just not attracting women, even for grassroots at high schools and universities. So it is that important piece of getting out into the community and letting individuals know that this is such a phenomenal career. And I'll speak personally for myself. I'm newer in the industry. I've been here for about 5 years. And if it wasn't for mentors, having individuals sponsor me, as well as those allies, I don't think I'd be sitting here today. So I'd like to shift it, and we'll start talking a little bit about that. And Tim, you brought this up, so I'm going to kick it off to you. Why did you decide to start mentoring women in finance?
I think part of it was just maybe related to that last topic that we had. I think there was an understanding through open discussion with my spouse, at least, sacrifices that had to be made so that when they're put in front of you, you realize there's an opportunity to do something about it. Second of it all, maybe it's not all that altruistic. As a leader, I've started to recognize that we actually have a fantastic number of high-performing young women who get in the business, but without that sponsorship and mentorship, they can't progress. And so what you see is, or what at least personally, what I recognize, the direct amount of time that I put into sponsoring and mentoring young women, I was paid back as a business leader for that. So it was very tangible. I found, and it's maybe it's an assumption that recognizing that there were barriers to overcome, finding young women who were hungry and wanted to overcome those barriers. If we just gave them a little help and a little mentorship and a little sponsorship, we actually saw just a fantastic return. In personally, I found that, and it became actually very rewarding at that point in time too. In each of my roles in the last number of years, I've tried to select and work with individual young women and ask them about what long-term career plans actually are, and to a point too where I'm blessed to be able to work with a number of women who who are not in my company or are spread out, but they've gone out and seen progression in their careers. So personally, it's rewarding as well, as not just in the fact that the business actually benefits from it too, which I think a number of leaders, if they just understood that there was an actual tangible gain back to it too, if that's the way you need to come around your head around to it, it's not a bad way. I think we're just giving that opportunity. And if I may, maybe there's one more too, and I think it is very specific to our industry as well. There have been numerous studies that have been published that shows the role that women in making financial decisions in households in Canada is just increasing exponentially. And where before that was very male dominated, you could probably try and make an argument that that was the reason why there were so many men in financial services. But right now we're at a spot where we probably don't reflect the consumer base that is making decisions right now. And this is maybe not only to speak from a women perspective, but I think of diversity and many other from race, religion. There are many opportunities for financial services to diversify, to reflect that fact that women and others are actually making most of the financial decisions and will make more of those financial decisions. So I don't think we have a choice but to mentor and sponsor to create more female executives and more female, make it easier for them to get into the industry, because we just need to reflect the society that we live in.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just thinking for our listeners today, Tanuja or Lara, do you have any advice for anyone just looking to find a mentor or a sponsor, or even for the men on the call that are perhaps interested in mentoring women?
mentorship and sponsorship is critical. And thank you, Tim, for everything you do at the side of your desk to help, women accelerate their careers in finance. I would say, just give me 1 second, I apologize. I would say that, building and nurturing your network for women and men throughout your career is critical. But as you advance, what's even more important, Aimee, is that you identify the sponsor, the individual person who has the seat at the table, who's going to advocate for you, and that you have a very clear path over 5-10 years, your trajectory in terms of, what your expectation is for increased seniority within your organization. But that sponsor and that individual who has the seat at the table and who's going to advocate for you is critical to ensure that that trajectory actually takes place. And so the piece of advice I would give Aimee, and I give it to both women and men, but is to really make nurturing that network, be very disciplined about that from before your career even begins. I give students this advice every day. And you have a spreadsheet. You write down the individual's names. When did you connect? What was your point? What were some of the points of the conversation that really resonated with you? When are you going to follow up? And then again, really treating that as a disciplined process, I think can pay dividends in individuals' careers over their career journey.
Thanks, Lara. Thanks, Tim. And I would just, there's not too much additional I would add, but I would say, I know for me that I, at very early in my career, I established, I'll say my advocates at that point. And so they've stayed with me throughout, call it my 25 years. And I've tried to intentionally build a network of different diverse people who've worked with me in different capacities. So one might be able to speak to my ability from an organizational standpoint or execution, and one might be able to speak to how I might lead, and one might be able to speak to my ability in a sales environment. And just so that there's a whole story about you that you can draw on different people over the course of your career.
Yeah, I love it. And there's one thing, I've got a few mentors and I've always just made sure that I'm coming with an agenda, or I'll even send it out beforehand just so they know what I'd really like to discuss with them when we do meet. And usually it's on a quarterly basis if I can make it work. Okay, well, thank you all for your insights on industry-wide trends and again, advice for our listeners. I'd like to pivot and get your perspectives on perhaps how advisors can better serve their female investors. Tim alluded to this, that we need to have a better understanding of the marketplace that we do serve. And so Tanuja, I'd love to start with you. You work with financial institutions across Canada. How do you believe advisors can prepare for this intergenerational wealth transfer and ensure their female clients are supported?
Yeah, thanks, Aimee. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I know from the role that I sit in, that a number of the financial institutions are grappling with, and to figure out how they help their advisors. And I think when we think about it, it's really, we're talking about how do we ensure that this next generation of women who are set to inherit, and whether that be younger, like at the kids' age, or spouses, that they feel well serviced by the family financial advisor, who typically might be a different generation or demographic, and maybe have generally different views than themselves. Like, for example, like let's say a 30-year-old young woman. So I'd say there's it's very multifaceted, and it will be incumbent on the advisor to actually prepare by understanding what's at the forefront of all this. So, for example, stats like 70% of women leave their financial advisor in the first year after their husband passes away. To Tim's point, that many women now, younger women, they are becoming more financially savvy, and they are, making a lot of the business decisions, whether that they just choose to, or whether they decide to get married later, or not at all, or they're just, want to be more independent. And so generally, yes, a lot more women are looking to become the decision makers. Also part of this, women tend to have longer retirements and will spend more time living alone during this time. So that's sort of what's at the forefront, but then there's all these nuances behind the scenes that if you're a male advisor, you might not necessarily understand that the reality for women is that, life comes at us a little bit harder. And I'd say we have this narrow margin of error, and we take more career points or breaks, just, as I sort of explained my experience. We tend to be the primary caregiver. Our salaries tend to plateau, but at the same time, this means that we save less for our retirement, but we usually live longer than our partners. And so there's all this stuff going on. And then to make it even worse, I guess, to overlay on top of all that, women want to invest in companies that are aligned with their values. And I'd say, I know here at NEI, right, where we talk about responsible investing, but I'd also say it's just about responsible leadership, right? So we want to invest in companies with these responsible leaders that make just good, sound decisions that we would feel comfortable sending our daughters to work at. And I think really that's what it comes down to. I think advisors, they really need to be aware of this. They need to know what to do with it and then how to leverage it to retain these assets when there's this intergenerational transfer of wealth.
I completely agree. And I say to advisors all the time, like, I am your client. I'm a millennial. I am a woman. I care about these things. You need to get on board with this. And then you'll get some of them that just want to shoo me away. But I believe more and more the industry is recognizing this. And so I'm just super proud to be part of an organization that's been leading in this space for over 35 years. Tim, Lara, can lean on you for any insights?
Maybe I'll just pull the thread a little bit on what Tanuja was talking about too, because I think that's the fundamental understanding. Advisors are going to have to understand who their client is, and maybe the way that they've dealt with clients in the past or households in the past is what has to change and morph over time. The understanding that you're actually dealing with an entity, whether it's a couple or an individual or two individuals and an entity at the exact same time that actually might not be aligned in what it is that the outcomes they're actually looking for. And I think in this space, I think financial advisors, and I'm hoping we're reaching financial advisors that we don't have to convince why ESG and responsible investing is good, but I'm thinking of the ones who still look at responsible investing or ESG as an allocation in their investment portfolios, and that's just simply not the truth. When you start to think of maybe the S and the G instead of the E, which I think has been at the forefront of what our space in investing is, we've just spent the first part of our whole discussion talking about corporate culture changes and governance changes that have to occur in order to be able to allow this to happen. And as we see the younger generation come up and this is instilled in the way that they think, it will also be instilled in the way that they invest their dollars. And so I think as we transition from what is a very real discussion on environmental and climate concerns, but to start to take broader scopes of understanding what actually is social investing and what is governance and good governance look like and good leadership look like. And for financial advisors who think that they're investing that way with women specifically, and they only want to take the environmental lens to it, I think it's such a narrow approach for women who are going to be, again, handling a lot of finances for a lot longer, as Tanuja says. So this ability to embrace what responsible investing and what social and governance investing actually looks like, I don't know. I'm not sure advisors are quite there yet, and that's the recommendation I would give them. Focus on the expanded part of the ESG component.
I absolutely agree, Tim, and really concur with all the comments that have been made, Aimee. The only thing I would add is that women really have a superpower when it comes to EQ and relationship management. And so much of the success around being, an advisor to individuals and helping them with their retirement planning is around trust. And trust is built through, relationship and dialogue and understanding of a client's, profile. And, I really believe that women do have a fantastic superpower when it comes to developing trust through that dialogue. And, it was interesting because I saw an advertisement, I think on CNBC recently, where a male advisor was speaking about his single mom. And maybe you've seen the same ad. and how, he now, relates to many of his clients in the advisory space as single parents. Perhaps perhaps they're widowed. But again, having that empathy and that understanding of providing that full perspective and the empathy around individual circumstances is I think a real advantage for women, and something that is really important for your male colleagues and male advisors to fully understand as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up with the last question. So to each of you, what is the best piece of advice that you've received, and what would you pass on to someone that perhaps is newer in their career? Tim, do you want to start it off?
Sure. And the question is directed at me, so I'll tell you the best piece of career advice that I had is I own my career. And so, whatever challenges anybody has, whether it's their educational background, experience background, their gender, their race, we're going to have to figure out how to overcome that. But you're your best advocate, is what somebody told me once. And so I was encouraged to hear, the other panelists talk about how actually give you some techniques and tips on how to own it. The most dangerous spots I ever got to in my career was when I thought the organization that I was working for would always have my best interest at heart all the time. And it's not that they didn't, it's just that I realized maybe I was one of a couple thousand employees. So the more you want to take control of your own career, the more you want to go and network, the more you want to own finding a mentor and owning what the outcomes of those relationships were. When I took that advice to heart and focused on that for myself, that's when I saw the greatest amount of progression in my own career.
Thank you. That's very true. Lara or Tanuja?
Go ahead, Lara.
Yeah, I would just build on a previous comment and Tim's sentiment as well around just really identifying that sponsor and somebody that's going to pull you up the proverbial broken rung of the ladder in the corporate environment. Corporate hierarchies, politics, they can be extremely difficult to navigate. And I would just add, Aimee, that it's really important to leverage your senior leaders, but also organizations like WCM, our programs like Aspire, Elevate, and Soar that you're very familiar with, to ensure that you have that external community to bounce your experiences off of each other. And you'll learn very quickly, and all four of us can attest to this in our own careers, that you're never alone in the context of certain barriers or experiences that you might find challenging over the course of your career. We're all humans. Human nature is remarkably consistent over generations. I think we have made a lot of progress. But when you face challenges, when you face what you believe is a barrier in your career, bounce it off of your network, bounce it off of communities like one you might find in WCM, just to make sure that you don't feel like, you're charting new territory.
So I'll add off, Aimee, and I'll say that, I think generally as women, we're always striving to be better. And I know for me, you always felt like we had to be better than our male counterparts. And I remember one of my leaders said to me one day, he said, you're not going to get it right every time. And it wasn't feedback that I expected from him. And it did catch me off guard, but it totally changed my perspective, because it just sort of made me step back and just think about what he said. And it almost just gave me the permission to just relax a bit, right? And take the edge off, and that I can just strive for excellence. I don't need to be perfect. And so that was, so that's sort of a bit of, guidance that I would keep in the back of my head. And I think it's just important, right? For people, when you're starting out, just to keep that as well, that just show up every day, do the best you can, strive for excellence, but it's okay. We're not perfect.
Oh, I love it, because I think in our industry, we talk a lot about imposter syndrome and coming into some of these roles and just realizing if we're our authentic selves, it's actually going to be better than in trying to put on this mask of perhaps who we're not are, because that can lead to burnout and other things.
Right.
So I want to take a moment just to thank Tanuja, Lara, and Tim for joining us today. I highly recommend that you do check out wcm.ca and get involved. It's an incredible organization. I've been a part of it for the last 3 years, and I can't speak highly enough of all of the content and the community that I have found there. So thank you. And then we also discussed a little bit about sustainable and responsible investing. And so please reach out to your VP of sales, your sales associate, and learn more about what we're doing at NEI. To Tim's point, we don't lead with the E. It really is around governance that's going to shape human capital and social policies. And then of course, how does that environmental impact influence a company as well as the communities that they live and work in? Happy International Women's Day. I very much encourage you to reach out to those around you, tell them how important they are, tell them about the accolades that they've achieved, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Aimee.